Looking back, we definitely should have took a train to scope out Paris's city center on our 7-hour layover, but we camped out in CDG Airport, made sure to catch our connection, landed in Athens, and arrived at our hotel in the Plaka district around 2 a.m. local time. After crashing hard from a red-eye flight out of Atlanta the night before, we were ready to explore the city of Athens. We stepped out of our hotel onto a busy pedestrian-only thoroughfare connecting the side streets of downtown Athens and navigated to our first stop. We gazed up to the monolithic Acropolis, towering over the city, and felt undeniably drawn to it as the kickstart to our exploration of Greece history and culture. On our hike to the summit, Allie and I passed beneath the gaze of ancient statues and wandered through empty theaters. A city of nearly 4 million spreads out to every horizon line, bordered sharply by mountains or coastline. In the 400 BC era, this lone mountain served as fortification for the city, a place of worship, and a social and commercial community hub. Seeing the preserved sites of the Parthenon, Temple of Athena Nike, and the neighborhoods in the city far below the Acropolis all made it surreally simple to imagine the bustling daily grind of those ancient times. Several city blocks are meticulously excavated and preserved on display beneath the foundations of the Acropolis Museum, which houses 3 stories of sculptures, reliefs, frescoes, and artifacts. Strolling through all that priceless history roped off or behind glass was cool, but being able to walk through the sites themselves was more fun throughout all the archaeological sites we visited. Compared to the more complete pieces housed safely in museum walls, seeing only lesser quality, more broken down artifacts left in their natural environment, exposed to the elements, was actually more exciting. Plus, museum photography is tricky. It rarely turns out as well as one hopes, and has flash or flat out no picture restrictions to navigate. After lunch, a summit hike, and a tour through the museum, it was time to head back to the hotel. We relaxed with some rooftop drinks, gazing out at the Acropolis, marveling at how we had just stood next to the massive columns mere hours ago. Dinner on the rooftop was a seafood and pasta treat, the perfect culinary sampling to close our first day's cultural tour of Greece. In the pre-dawn hours of our walk to the Athens train station, trashy spray paint vandalism gradually morphed into graffiti murals as we left the downtown outskirts and ventured north to the public transport center and train station. 4 hours later, we arrived in an alpine village with soaring rock pillars marching straight down to the city limits. We find our group of 30 people and pile onto a coach bus to drive up hairpin turns and switchback cliffside highways that wind between the network of meteora, or lofty elevated monasteries. Today, our guide tells us, is the height of climbing season, and as we get closer to the rocks, we begin to see people dotting the cliffs like ants, huddled together in spots, suspended alone, strung out along vertical routes, and perched triumphantly atop summits. We learned that Greek Orthodox monks of the 11th through 14th centuries were dwelling in caves of the rock formations that dominated these valleys and foothills of the nearby Pindos Mountains. Then they began building monasteries protectively hidden from Turkish persecutors in the cliffs. They isolated themselves for their ascetic worship in the mountains. The planning and transport of materials stages alone took 25 years, in some cases, before the construction of the actual monasteries could even begin on their remote build sites. 24 monasteries were built, but only 6 remain today. A handful of monks live in 5 of them, and nuns occupy the 6th after reconstructing it following the bombing and destruction of it by Nazis, supposing the then current monks were housing insurgents. Our tour bus made stops at 3 of the 6 monasteries, and we got to walk insanely steep and narrow natural rock stairway and tunnel systems that had us hiking and out of breath by the time we reached the building's overlooks. James Bond was filmed at one of them. Game of Thrones was shot among the mountains and valleys separating many of them. The nunnery turned away men and women who were unfortunate enough to have not read that legs and shoulders must be covered for modesty's sake. Jokes were made that a poor fellow wouldn't be allowed to view the interior for fear his calves would drive the old nuns wild. Inside, these buildings were resplendent, with frescoes covering every inch of some inner sanctums, opulent gold and silver-plated artifacts, meticulously manicured courtyard gardens, and shocking engineering that integrates with the natural environment. Rope systems, pulleys, and dumbwaiters all play a part in daily life for the folks living at these religious refuges. After about 5 hours of touring these rock pillars that were once prehistoric riverbed, we returned to our train station for the long sunset ride back to Athens. We enjoyed another late-night dinner on our hotel's rooftop and packed our bags to meet our tour guide Nikos in the morning. The next day, we would embark on our 3-day adventure around the Peloponnese Peninsula, southwest of Athens in mainland Greece. Allie and I had time for a quick breakfast in the hotel restaurant, taking in one final view of the Acropolis through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. Punctual to the minute, a new black Ford Euro minivan pulled up to the street parking cutout in front of us. Our guide for the next 3 days would be Theo. Our first stop was the Corinth Canal, separating the Saronic Gulf and the Gulf of Corinth. After Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1830, passion was ignited to finish a complete canal through this isthmus. A brief walk across the canal later, we were back in the van, cruising the coastal interstate. The Saronic had been on our left, with the island of Salamina floating beautifully on the horizon. Now, the Gulf of Corinth was on our right, for the quick jaunt to the ancient site of Corinth. Similar to Athens, Corinth had an Acropolis built on the mountain, rising highest above all the surrounding area. Unlike Athens' Acropolis, with its wealth of temples, Parthenon, and Dionysian theaters, we didn't visit this summit, as the fortification's ruined walls are the only remaining artifacts. They're clearly visible atop the hill and help anchor the view of the city-state from the street-level view of the Agora. This marketplace once housed block after block of temples, shops, and public squares. The New Testament book of Corinthians was a letter written by the Apostle Paul, addressed to the early church of Corinth in the 1st century. Within view of the Temple of Apollo, Paul stood trial for his heresy of spreading Christianity in a culture ruled by the Holy Roman Empire. The columns of the temple, along with several statues, ornamental pediments, and ancient foundations, all lend to the atmosphere of a preserved community that was once so lively. We finish snapping our final photos of the archaeological site, spot Theo in the parking lot pulling the van around, and take one last look at the coast. Our next stop will take us away from the sea, up into the mountains. We settle in for a 2-hour drive, dozing on and off as the vineyards and alpine meadows unroll lazily before our drooping eyelids. Allie and I both roused from naps together as our van navigated serpentine roads built into the mountains. Theo told us the beautiful sunny weather we'd been experiencing was typical of Greek summers. They received so little rain that we spotted a forest fire on a nearby mountainside near the Corinth Canal and firefighting planes dropping their water tank payloads. Our next stop at the Cave of the Lakes was set in a scenic mountain forest. We followed Theo and another small tour group into the massive metal doors, cut directly into the rock and into a small antechamber, stepping onto a metal catwalk. We got to walk through this chamber, marveling at stalactites and stalagmites, iridescent glows emitted by weathered mineral deposits, and the trail blazes marking the route to additional caves closed to the public, still only remotely accessible by experts. The Cave of the Lakes is a relatively new natural attraction, but its prehistoric fossil record includes humans and hippopotamus. It was opened in the 90s after spelunkers discovered the vast series of chambers that run with subterranean river rapids and waterfalls in the winter. During the summer, the caverns dry up and an impressive triple-layer cascading pool effect emerges. The whole scene gives off a Luray Caverns set in a remote, off-the-beaten-path portion of Busch Gardens vibe. From the pictures online of explorers rafting through the inaccessible cave's river, it seems clear this might be a place worth revisiting. For now, our stomachs are growling and urging us on along our busy itinerary. We have another hour or so in the van to wind through these alpine vistas before we'll arrive at our next destinations for history, lunch, and a new mode of transportation. Our trip through the Peloponnese Mountains continued past the second most popular ski resort in Greece and miles of valley farmland. The town was a beautiful alpine village, complete with cobblestone pedestrian streets and classical architecture. We stopped for lunch, and our guide Theo ordered some dishes based on our tastes. Veal and chicken, eggplant dip and zucchini pie. Everything was homemade and sitting on the small sidewalk tables outside the small brick front restaurant gave the meal an added air of hominess. We stopped at the sobering Place of Sacrifice, where a massacre committed by Nazis wiped out an entire village's male population 12 years of age and older, and many of their graves overlooked the rebuilt town of Kalavrycha in the valley below. A famous train runs from the town center through the mountains and river gorges, running parallel to the water. The views are so grand they overflow the meager picture windows of the modest passenger train. As Theo picks us up at the final train stop, we gratefully collapse in the passenger van as he whisks us through more coastal and mountain highways. Windmills dot the horizon's jagged peaks on a faraway mountain range as the sun begins sinking. It's been a long day since waking up in our Athens hotel, but 6 traveling stops and a few naps later, we finally perk up to our van on an impossibly steep, narrow residential road that opens to the courtyard of a hilltop duplex overlooking the coast and the city of Hermione. Our host, Jota, stays in the unit upstairs and provides us Wi-Fi, laundry, kitchen, and hot water logistics before disappearing. Allie and I make some food in the kitchen, relax in the living room, then quickly crash hard for the night. Tomorrow is a much-needed leisure day on the island of Hydra. Allie and I met Theo outside the courtyard in the circular drive serving Jota's house. A quick drive later, we were purchasing ferry tickets and hopping onto a 60 to 80 person vessel. The wind was swift and cool, adding to the relief of the shaded lower deck of the 2-story ferry. The voyage to Hydra was gorgeous. Rocky coasts and shorelines disappeared under perfectly blue skies splotched with puffy white clouds. Disembarking on the island, we wandered a bustling dock with locals leading donkeys for tours. Several restaurants were dockside, serving up all types of drinks, desserts, snacks, and meals. Seafood dominated the fare, and Allie and I enjoyed some mussels in an herbaceous broth that completely redefined our concept of the perfect steamed mussel. After a short stroll through the claustrophobic residential streets of the island's interior, we toured the coastlines in either direction from port. To the left, we found several swimming holes and sandy beaches with diving platforms scattered among the restaurants and shops on the cliffs. The ocean surged and crashed against the shores, occasionally splashing high enough to soak the revelers laid out above. I swam to an outcrop and climbed the rocks to a suitable height. I practiced a few leaps there before climbing to a perch 3 times higher. The fall was exhilarating, a solid 2 seconds.
This is a little one. Just gonna try a little front flip. Couldn't be more than what? 5-6 feet. Nothing like that. 30, 35 are over there.
Standing at the top, I recalled the story our waiter had told us earlier over our lunch of mussels.
Here we go.
He had given us directions to the best diving cliffs and told us about how he'd been trying to show off and landed on his head from a 15-meter cliff. I finally worked up the nerve to force those images from my mind and take a leap of faith into thin air. Allie and I grabbed some milkshakes, hopped on our return ferry, and watched Hydra sink into the distance. We made it back to our guest house in time for some stunning sunsets over the sea. Tomorrow would be our last day with Theo, but we'd stop at a few archaeological sites before he transported us back to mainland Greece and the Athens airport to catch our 5 p.m. flight to Santorini. As for tonight, Theo offered to drive us into town for dinner. We had some food stocked in the fridge for us and had purchased a bottle of wine on Hydra though, so we decided to enjoy a quiet night in the guest house after our island excursion. To start our final day with Guide Theo, we said our goodbyes to Jota and hit the road for an hour or two. Allie and I made our first stop at Epidaurus. These last few stops would be some of the more ancient Greek sites we'd visit during our trip. Epidaurus contains the largest intact theater in all of Greece and extensive ruins of an ancient city complete with bathhouse and temples. The theater was renowned for its ancient acoustics, and standing in the exact center of the stage, Allie's voice projects to the uppermost seats where I can hear her clearly. Like most of the archaeological sites we visited, there was a museum on site that housed some of the more complete or reconstructed pieces and artwork of each particular location. Wandering through the shady groves between the theater and the city center made us imagine the ebb and flow of daily life back in the 14th century BC. Also known for its worship of Asclepius, a divine healing god, the city of Epidaurus financially benefited greatly from the donations, offerings, and tributes paid by pilgrims visiting the healing god's temple. After an hour or so of exploring, snapping photos, and watching an excavation team work, we left this UNESCO World Heritage Site to journey onward to Nafplio. Our guide Theo told us that the fortress of Palamidi overlooked a gulf where the Aegean met the Sea of Crete, giving it a strategic geographic advantage. Perched atop a mountain overlooking the city, the fortress was well fortified with parapets and high walls accessible by 999 stone steps carved into the mountainside. Dungeons and prison cells lined the walls of some inner keeps, and we got to enter some of the interior holds that housed solitary confinement cells deep in the fortress interior for serious offenders and key military prisoners. After descending the 999th stair to the modern-day city sidewalk and busy city street, we met Theo and walked into town to have lunch at a corner bistro. The large shaded patio looked inviting. The weather was beautifully sunny, but the hike up and down a mountain and heat of the day drove us into the relief of the restaurant's air conditioning. We selected a table under a fan. Theo spoke a few words in Greek to the manager, and soon we had plates of food stacking around the table, sampling bean purees, potato dishes, eggplant and beef with herbed rice, and the requisite Greek salad, replete with resplendent feta that crumbled perfectly with each bite. Several cups of water and iced tea later, we felt bold enough to venture back into the heat for a stroll around the city. We viewed statues of Turkish conquerors and city architecture reflecting the changing cultures of rulers over the course of history. Today, busy shops and restaurants crowd the narrow streets of pedestrian malls. We funneled down one lane to the city harbor and returned along the coast to our car. In an hour, we'd be in Mycenaea, our final stop with Theo on our guided tour of Greece's Peloponnese Peninsula. Mycenaea was the oldest archaeological site we saw on the trip and had the most ruins to show for it. Several tombs, pits, and foundations were all that remained as Ali and I explored the hillside city prominent in the 1300s BC for its gold and military advantage. The Lion Gate is a famous relief sculpture that marks the entrance to the city. The on-site museum at this location is one of the most impressive, with model replicas of the city and dozens of authentic artifacts. We shuttled down the hillside with Theo to a satellite memorial where the tomb of Agamemnon is believed to be. After exploring all of these stops, it was finally time to fly off the mainland to the island of Santorini. Theo dropped us at the airport in Athens, and we embarked on a quick 30-minute jaunt in the late evening hours over the Aegean. We checked into our hotel and slept soundly, knowing we'd be staying in the same place for a couple of nights. The Belvedere Suites in Thera was situated on the high, steep cliffs of the inner crescent of the island. Santorini was originally a large circular island with a volcano situated near the center. After many ancient eruptions, the island collapsed into the sea, spawning the Atlantis myths of history. After a good night's sleep, Ali and I stepped out of our hotel room to the balcony overlooking the pool, cliffs, ocean, and the rocky remains of the caldera of the volcano sitting in the sea like a sleeping dragon. The weather was bright and sunny, a cool breeze bringing relief in the heat of the day, and a subtle chill in the shade during the evenings. We lounged at the poolside bar, dipping into the ice-cold water and basking on the iconic white stone deck. Tropical cocktails were the perfect precursor to a stroll through the village marketplace to shop and scope out delicious food for lunch. We had enough tapas of octopus, hummus, and mussels to hold us over until a barbecued seafood dinner during our sunset tour scheduled on a catamaran. A shuttle drove us to a marina near the southern tip of the crescent-shaped mainland of Santorini. From there, we voyaged up the inner curve of the island, anchoring offshore of various beaches for photos or to snorkel and dive from the boat. We eventually made our way to the middle latitude of the waters between the mainland and the caldera and smaller islands dotting the waters of Santorini. We set course straight through some of the broken remains of the volcano's surrounding landscape, then anchored for a bit to disembark and swim through some volcanic warm springs. As we watched the sun dip below the sea on our cruise back to port, Allie and I soaked in as much of the surroundings and experience as possible, saving up the memory to return and access again and again for a lifetime. Another good night's rest led to a quick morning stroll away from the hotel tourist market through the livelier downtown section of Thera. The dramatic architecture set against the backdrop of the inspiring landscape was truly a joy to behold. The next morning, we beat the sunrise and were on a flight from Athens to Amsterdam just after dawn. Descending into the Netherlands, windmills and patchwork blocks of agricultural fields scrolled by our window. We quickly made our way to the metro train that covered the 20-minute jaunt from Schiphol Airport to the city center transportation depot. Allie and I admired the famous canals and made sure to keep our heads on a swivel as massive amounts of bicycle commuters zipped through pedestrian and vehicle intersections. We stopped in at a coffee shop on the canal for hot chocolate and to escape the mid-morning chill of early autumn in the Netherlands. As we ventured out to sightsee, we marveled at the Victorian and Gothic-inspired architecture, contrasting strikingly with the classical Greek style to which we had become so accustomed. After a solemn stop to pay our respects at the Anne Frank House, we hustled back to the train and returned to Schiphol Airport to gift shop and relax as we awaited our final flight home to Atlanta.